Rain fell in a steady drizzle, soaking the already damp earth of the cemetery. The air was thick with the scent of wet grass and decaying leaves, and the gray sky seemed to press down on the world like a heavy blanket. James Carter pulled his coat tighter around himself, cursing under his breath as he trudged through the mud. He hadn't planned on being here today, but life had a funny way of throwing curveballs. His grandmother's funeral had been that morning, and now, as the last of the mourners had left, he found himself wandering the rows of headstones, lost in thought. James wasn't a sentimental man. He hadn't been close to his grandmother, or to much of his family for that matter. But something about the quiet solitude of the cemetery drew him in. Maybe it was the way the rain muffled the sounds of the outside world, or the way the rows of graves seemed to stretch on forever, each one a silent testament to a life once lived. Whatever it was, he couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. He wandered aimlessly, reading the names and dates on the headstones as he passed. Some were old, their inscriptions worn smooth by time and weather. Others were newer, their polished surfaces gleaming even in the dim light. He paused at one, a small, unassuming marker with a single name, Eleanor Carter. His grandmother. He stared at it for a long moment, feeling nothing but a vague sense of unease. Then he turned and kept walking. It was as he rounded the corner of a particularly large mausoleum that he saw it. The headstone was simple, almost plain, but something about it caught his eye. He stopped, frowning, and took a step closer. The name etched into the stone was unmistakable, James Carter. His breath caught in his throat. That was impossible. He blinked, sure he was seeing things, but the name didn't change. Beneath it were two dates, his birth date, and a date just a few days from now. For a moment, he couldn't move. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It had to be a mistake. A coincidence. There had to be another James Carter out there, someone with the same name, the same birthday. But the odds of that were astronomical. And even if it was a coincidence, why would the death date be so close? It didn't make any sense. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold stone. The dates were real, carved deep into the surface. He traced them with his fingertips, as if touching them would make them disappear. But they didn't. They were there, solid and unyielding. A chill ran down his spine, and he suddenly became aware of how alone he was. The cemetery was empty, the only sound the soft patter of rain on the ground. He took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. This was crazy. He needed to get out of here, to clear his head. He turned and started walking, his pace quickening with every step. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following him. But there was nothing. Just rows of graves, stretching out in every direction. By the time he reached the edge of the cemetery, he was practically running. He fumbled with the gate, his hands slick with rain, and finally managed to push it open. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, breathing hard, and turned to look back at the cemetery. It looked the same as it always had, quiet and still. But something about it felt different now. Dangerous. He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts that were swirling in his mind. It was just a coincidence. That was all. He would go home, pour himself a drink, and forget all about it. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't be able to. The image of that headstone was burned into his mind, and no amount of alcohol would erase it. The next few days passed in a blur. James tried to go about his life as usual, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He found himself looking over his shoulder more often, jumping at every little sound. He stopped sleeping, the fear of what might happen keeping him awake long into the night. And then, on the evening of the date carved into the headstone, it happened. He was walking home from work, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of the gravestone, when he heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the alleyway beside him. He stopped, his heart pounding, and peered into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. But then, slowly, a figure emerged. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows. James took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The figure stepped closer, and he could see now that it was a man, dressed in a long, tattered coat. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his lips curled into a cruel smile. "James Carter," the man said, his voice low and rasping. "You've been expecting me, haven't you?" James didn't answer. He couldn't. His legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the spot as the man stepped closer. He wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't move. The man reached out, his fingers cold as they brushed against James's cheek. "It's time," the man whispered. And then, everything went black. When James opened his eyes, he was lying on the ground, the cold rain soaking through his clothes. He sat up, his head spinning, and looked around. He was back in the cemetery, standing in front of the headstone with his name on it. But something was different. The dates had changed. The death date was no longer a few days from now. It was today. He stared at the stone, his heart pounding in his chest. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. But as he looked down at his hands, he saw that they were pale and translucent, like the hands of a ghost. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was trapped, caught between life and death, with no way to escape. And then, as the rain continued to fall, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned, and there was the man from the alley, his hollow eyes staring into James's soul. "Welcome," the man said, his voice echoing in the empty cemetery. "You're home now." And with that, James felt himself being pulled into the darkness, his screams swallowed by the night. The last thing he saw was the headstone, his name etched into the stone, a permanent reminder of the fate he could never escape.